All right. Thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Kathy Wiens, and I'm here to talk to you today about being a survivor of child abuse during this COVID-19 pandemic and some things that we might be experiencing, and then also some things that we can do. I'm also going to share my personal story with you of the abuse that I suffered in my childhood, and also how this current Corona-19 virus is affecting my responses. Let me just first introduce myself. I'm so thankful to be able to be here with Into Account today. I am the board chair for Into Account. I'm also a trauma recovery coach, as you can see on this screen. My website is there. Along with abuse issues, I educate on child protection and sexual abuse prevention for churches. I'm a speaker and a blogger for Dove's Nest, and I also work with Grace as a witness support specialist. So I'm very glad to be here today to talk about this important topic. The first thing that I want to talk about is how trauma is processed in the brain. I think this is a good foundation for us to understand. For many of you, this might be information that you have already heard before. But again, I think it's good to go over to help us understand what is happening to us, not just with our emotions, but also the way our brain is processing it. And so this is a very simplistic view of the brain. I'm not a brain researcher. I have studied this and know a little bit more about it, but again, this is a really simplistic view. So I'm going to look at the three parts of the brain. So first there is the brain stem. And the brain stem is the part of our brain that controls our autonomic functions, like our heart rate and breathing, blood pressure, things like that, things that we don't have to think about doing, but that our body is doing all the time. And so when we get into a fight or flight mode, when we feel threatened, when there's some sort of trauma, we're experiencing some sort of threat or trauma, our brain is going to get, our brain stem is going to get our body ready to fight or flight by producing the hormones that we need, the cortisol and the adrenaline, to get our heart pumping so that we can stand and fight or run away, flight. The next part of our brain is this midbrain. And that's the limbic system, and that's the emotional part of the brain. And the amygdala is housed in that part of the brain, and the amygdala is the fear center. And so the brain stem and the amygdala kind of work together when we have a threat to us. The amygdala will send that signal to the brain stem that threat, we got to take care of ourselves, and then the brain stem will get our body ready to either fight or flight. The next part of the brain, the third part, is what's called the neocortex, and that's the last area of the brain to develop. And it's in the neocortex is the prefrontal cortex, and that's the thinking part of the brain. And so the brain that has executive function. Okay, so those are the three parts of the brain. All right, so what happens when we experience trauma or we experience a threat? How does that relate? Why am I telling you all of this, and how does that relate to childhood trauma? Well, let me just give you an example. So right now, we are all pretty much functioning in our prefrontal cortex. You know, this is a stressful time, so some of us may be anxious or nervous or feeling fearful. But right now, I'm giving you language. You're hearing the language, you're processing the language, so we're all working in our prefrontal cortex. However, if the room that you are in, or the room that I am in, if someone would come in with a gun and threaten our lives, we would get out of the prefrontal cortex and immediately go back into our brainstem and our limbic system, and our body would get ready to fight or flight. And we know that because just think about that. If someone would walk in with a gun, you would not be thinking critically about that. You know, you would not be sitting there saying, well, I wonder what kind of gun that is. Is that a rifle or an AK-47 or a pistol? Or I wonder what he's going to do with that gun. Maybe he's going to shoot me. I bet I should find some cover. You know, our brains would not be doing that. We would immediately go into the fight or flight mode, and our bodies would get ready to either run away or to stand and fight. Okay. Now, for those of us who have experienced childhood trauma, and of course, everyone's journey is different, but for many of us who have experienced childhood trauma, that person with the gun is there all the time, or was there all the time in our childhood. Again, everyone's situation is different, but that threat of danger, if you have had prolonged chronic childhood abuse, that threat was there constantly. And so your body was constantly in that fight or flight mode. How does that relate to today? Well, like we talked about, when there's a threat to us, the prefrontal cortex goes offline, but also the part of our brain that processes time also goes offline, because our brain, its main job is to keep us safe. And so it says, I don't need time, I don't need to think critically, I just need to get going and protect myself. And the reason it's important to think about the concept of time being taken away when we are in trauma is that currently in our day-to-day life now, when things happen that remind us of the trauma that we experienced in childhood, why is this important? How does this all relate to what we're experiencing now with the COVID-19 pandemic? Well, currently, we are experiencing some things that may be triggering us, triggering things from the past. And so what is a trigger? Well, a trigger is something that not only reminds us of something that happened in our past, but it actually pulls us back into the past. And again, our brain doesn't track time when we are in when there's a threat or we're feeling or there's trauma happening in our life. Our brain doesn't track time in the same way. And so when we are being triggered today by something that's happening with COVID-19, our mind feels like we are back in our childhood experiencing that same thing. And so we oftentimes, and again, everyone's journey is different, but oftentimes we are seeing the current situation through the eyes of the child that was experiencing the trauma. Let me just share a little bit about my history and the abuse that I suffered. So for the first 10 years of my life, I lived with my biological family. I had a brother who was 7 years older than me, a half brother, stepfather, and my biological mother. And my stepfather and my mother were both addicted to alcohol. We lived in extreme poverty, and there was neglect, pretty severe neglect, and abuse issues, sexual abuse primarily, and that was from my brother, but then also some other family members. Then when I was 9, my stepfather died, and then the family really started to go downhill. And so my brother started bringing friends in, he started drinking, my mother's drinking accelerated, and she was bringing unsafe men into the house. And so as a 9 and then 10-year-old child, my life was becoming very unsafe. And SRS had been called a couple of times, and the second time they were called, I was removed from the home. I spent 5 months in a children's home, and then I went to live with my foster adoptive family, my forever family. That's where the Berkey name comes from. That's the B in my name, Kathy Wiens. And after that, the abuse stopped, and my life was pretty good after that. Okay, so it's a little bit different here. You see we have changed venues. Actually, we haven't. But the earlier part that I recorded was on Zoom, and I had some technical difficulties with that. I have not done a recording like this before. So anyway, to finish the recording, I decided I would just take down that background on Zoom and record this on my Windows Movie Maker, and it just makes it a lot easier. So here we are. All right, so I had shared with you my childhood experience, and now I want to let you know how that experience is affecting me and triggering me with this current COVID-19 pandemic. And let me say first that really I have a lot of resources, and I have it pretty good. I can do my work from home. I don't have to go out every day and go to work. So I'm not out there in among, people and being afraid of getting the virus. I also don't have children at home, so I don't have that responsibility. I have a lot of resources, and I have a lot of financial resources, and also I have support from family and friends. And I tell you that because if I am being triggered with, as a person who has a lot of resources, if I am being triggered, then don't feel bad. Don't shame yourself for the fact that you are being triggered in this current situation. It is normal. So I just want to share that with you to let you know that it is hard for everyone, and even someone like me who has a lot of resources, it's still really hard. Okay, let me just share 3 ways that I have been triggered currently. Okay, so the first thing that I want to share with you is, I think it was a couple of weeks ago when they gave some projections of how many people would die. And that was, of course, very scary to think, a lot of people have already died from the COVID-19 pandemic. And then they were telling us all of these other people that were going to die, a large amount of people. And so part of that was how many people are going to die and who are those people going to be? And just the realization and the sadness that comes from that realizing that's something that could happen. The next part of that for me was they also talk about people who are on the front lines. And some of those people who are on the front lines are healthcare workers. Well, my husband of 35 years and my daughter, my youngest daughter, are both family medicine doctors. And so they are people who will be on the front lines depending on how bad it gets in our area. And I'm in the Midwest, and so it hasn't hit here really strong, but that's part of the uncertainty that we don't know. So the 2 things that came together for me there were a lot more people are going to die, and 2 of my closest family members are on the front lines. And so hearing that, I went into this panic and anxiety, and I was crying, and I just was having a really hard time with that. And finally, after about an hour of experiencing this high anxiety, I stopped and I thought, what do I tell my clients in situations like this? And so I tell them, you can only control what you can control. And think about where this is coming from. How does that feel like your past, the abuse from your past? And so I thought about that. Well, what was triggering me from the past was that what I just shared with you, as a 10-year-old child, I lost my entire family. And now I was again being confronted with the fear of losing a large part of my family. And that was very scary. It caused a lot of fear in me. What I had to stop and realize, though, is I'm not a 10-year-old girl anymore. And even if the worst thing would happen and both my husband and my daughter should die because of this pandemic, I still have family. I wouldn't be completely alone like I was as a 10-year-old child. I still have family. I still have resources. And I'm not a little girl anymore. I am a grown woman, and I can take care of myself. And so I had to stop and think about that to help me understand why I was feeling so much fear and anxiety over the situation. Now, the reality is this is a scary time. But that was being increased in me because of this triggering of the trauma that I had experienced as a child. Okay, so that was one thing. Another thing that has come up for me with this current COVID-19 pandemic is the concept of food scarcity. You know, this is something, especially toilet paper. Of course, toilet paper isn't food, but this has been an issue. You know, can we go and get food? How often do we go to the grocery store? Is there going to be food when we go to the grocery store? And what I was experiencing was so I have some canned foods. I did stock up, and I have frozen foods. And it's been really hard for me, and it's created a lot of anxiety in me when I think about, okay, should I be using these canned foods? I better save them because I might need them in the future. But I don't want to get rid of all my frozen foods either. What if my freezer dies? What if electricity goes off and I lose all of my frozen foods? And so this was creating a lot of fear and anxiety in me. And then I realized, well, as a child, there was a lot of food scarcity in my life. There were many times when I was very hungry and I didn't have enough food. And there's one experience that I had when I was in 3rd grade. I went to school and I probably had not had any breakfast that morning, and maybe not any supper the night before, or not an adequate supper the night before. But I was sitting in my desk and I just started shaking and crying, and I couldn't stop myself, and I didn't know what was happening, and it was really scary. And when my teacher came over to see what was going on, all I could get out was, "I'm hungry." That's all I could say through my shaking and through my tears. And so they gave me a peanut butter sandwich and a carton of milk, and that helped to calm me down. Now, I'm not sure what that episode was. It was probably some kind of, you know, low blood sugar situation. But I know what it's like to really be hungry. And so this idea of food scarcity now is triggering me because I had so much food scarcity in my past. But again, I have to think about the reality of now. I am not that 10-year-old girl anymore. I do have enough food. The reality is when I go to the grocery store, I can get most things. And even if I had to live for 2 months, my husband and I, and it's just the two of us at home, even if I had to live for 2 months without going to the grocery store, we would probably have enough food to eat. Now, we might have to make some pretty creative combinations at the end, but we would have enough food. And so I have to think about that in real time. What is happening to me now? And understand I'm not that 10-year-old girl anymore. I'm a grown woman, and I have resources and I have choices. Okay? And then the last thing I want to share with you is just about just general fear and anxiety and grief. Let me read something to you. This is a book that I really like. And when let me say too, with a lot of the work that I've done in therapy and recovering from child abuse, and that's been, you know, a 35-year journey for me, I have done a lot of inner child work. And I'm not going to talk extensively about that here, but that's what's happening is when we get triggered, it's that child from the past. You know, I said we're seeing it through the child's eyes. We're seeing the current reality through the past, through the child's eyes. And so we need to help that child feel safe and secure and know that she's okay, because we are now the adult and we can not only take care of ourselves, but we can take care of that child from the past. And so this reading is from, I'll show this to you, Affirmations for the Inner Child. And this is a really good book that I often read. And let me just share with you, this was from March 31. There were nights when I had to lay in bed listening to alcoholic arguments, afraid to go to the bathroom. I learned to hold my breath during violent episodes at home in order not to feel anything. My mind remained on mental alert 24 hours a day, but my body longed for rest. And remember how I said, as a child, when we were experiencing the abuse, the trauma was constant. And again, everyone's situation is different, but that person at the door was always there. That threat was always there. And that's what this talks about. But think about our current situation. aren't we all kind of holding our breath, just waiting to see what's going to happen, when this will be over, when we will be able to go back to normal, if we ever are able to go back to our life as normal? And so what we experienced in the past is also fueling this fear and anxiety that is happening in the future. It's like a fire that gives even more fuel to this current situation. And let's think about what anxiety is. Well, anxiety is fear and worry over what may happen in the future. So it's always future oriented. Now, it's something that may happen, but it's also something that may not happen. And when that fear and anxiety has a fire under it from the past and it is being fueled, then that creates even more fear and anxiety. And sometimes we can get these looping thoughts where we just get on a fear or an anxiety or something we think may happen, and it's difficult to stop thinking about that. So these are the things that can be happening to us now with this current situation if we have experienced childhood abuse. So what can we do about it? And this is the part that I like to talk about. As a trauma recovery coach, I like to help my clients think about how they can use the strengths and the tools that they have in their current moment to help them. And so one of the things that we can do is exactly what I've been talking about. When we are feeling this tremendous fear and anxiety, to just stop and to try and stop. Sometimes that's not easy to do, but to do some grounding, to just try and stop and think about, where is that coming from and what can I control? And so that's what I had to do when I was worrying about losing family and food scarcity and just the general fear and anxiety, to stop and think about where it's coming from the past. And when we do that, what we are actually doing is we are taking those the fears and anxieties that are stirring up, especially in the amygdala, which again is the fear center. So our brainstem and our limbic system, the amygdala, the fear center are all being activated when we have these anxious thoughts. And if we can stop ourselves and think about it, we can move it up here to our prefrontal cortex, and we can think more rationally and more logically about it. And that's just going to help to calm us down, because it's taking it out of the brainstem and the limbic system, which is producing the cortisol and the adrenaline, and it's putting it up here in the prefrontal cortex, which can help calm us down. So that's the first thing to do. The next thing to do, and maybe this should really be the first thing, but to not shame ourselves, to just be gentle with ourselves and care about ourselves, to realize this is where we're at, to understand that if we need to stay in bed all day, well, maybe that's okay. You know, if the only thing we can do is sit on the couch and watch TV, be gentle with yourselves. Don't judge yourself for that. Do what you need to do to get through this current time. So being gentle with yourself is really important. And I've said this before, but I'll say it again. Think about what you can control and realize you are not that child anymore in the past. You do have more resources as an adult. There is more that you can control in the current situation than you could when you were a child. So try to see it through the adult eyes, the current situation through the adult eyes, rather than through the child's eyes, the child of the past. And there are many good practices that we can do, and I'm sure you've heard about a lot of these things, but just simple things like going outside, getting exercise, spending time in the sunshine and outside. If you can exercise outside, that's really good too. If you can't, just getting exercise is good. Trying to eat healthy foods, trying to get enough sleep. And I know sometimes sleep is hard when we feel so anxious. For me, one thing that I do that's really good is meditating. And that, again, is something that just helps to calm down our central nervous system, to calm down the brainstem and the limbic system. So meditation is good. Yoga also helps to calm our body down. It helps us get in touch with our body, and that helps to calm us down. So those are some things that we can do, and there certainly is a lot more, but those are just a few of the things we can do. Another thing that I want to talk about, and this is something that I have talked about with clients and have thought about a lot in my own life, is developing a toolbox, a mental health toolbox. And so thinking about the things that we would put in a mental health toolbox. Well, all of these things that we have talked about, these good things that we do for ourselves, those things go in our mental health toolbox. And I have a friend who actually has gotten a physical box, and she calls it her self-care box. And she put physical things in there like hand lotion to help ground herself by that, feeling the lotion rubbing between her hands, Play-Doh or a candle or, pictures or quotes, things like that. So those are the kinds of things that we have in a mental health toolbox or a self-care box. But recently I heard a video that talked about toolboxes in a different way, and I want to share that with you too. We all have an old toolbox. Even if we're trying to develop these new toolboxes, we still have an old toolbox. And there are many things in our old toolbox. And those are the kinds of things that have always comforted us. Some of them are still good and we can still use them, but some of them are not good and they can be self-destructive. And I think it's important to, again, be gentle with ourselves and to say, if I need to use some of these things from my old toolbox, that's okay. I can. One of the things for me that I have in my old toolbox is chocolate cupcakes, chocolate cake, chocolate candy. You're seeing a theme here. So that's one of the things that I do. And the last time I was at the store, I think it was about a couple weeks ago, and I bought two bags of Dove's chocolates. Now they're not all gone, so that's a good thing. I didn't eat them all in one sitting. So I took something from my old toolbox, but I tried to use it in an okay way. And that's the balance that we need to do, because we don't want to take those things from our old toolbox, and you're seeing Jack back there. That's my dog. That's my real life. Anyway, we don't want to take these things from our old toolbox and use them in a self-destructive way. So thinking about that, how can we build a new toolbox, but not to shame ourselves from when we use things from our old toolbox? It's okay. And the last thing that I want to say, and I realized this one night when I was sitting here, it was later at night, my husband was in bed, and I'm sitting here alone, and evenings are always harder for me. There's more sadness, there's more depression, there's more hopelessness in the evening. And so I was sitting here and I was just thinking, this is really hard. And that's the reality. This COVID-19 pandemic is just really, really hard. And I think just the realization, the accepting of that can help us. It's not going to last forever. Most of us will make it through. We will come out on the other side and we will be okay. But for right now, it is really, really hard. And it's okay to just accept that fact. And again, to be gentle with yourself, to care for yourself, to love those people around you, to reach out and to support other people. Those are all good things to do. So I hope visiting here today with you has been a support and a help for you. And again, I want to thank Stephanie and Into Account for allowing me to be here and share this with you. Take care of yourself. Bye-bye.